Welcome back. Tonight, we explore one of the most layered, unsettling, and quietly fascinating worlds in survival horror history, the lore of Resident Evil 4. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream. The parasite that predates civilization, the organism at the heart of Resident Evil 4's terror, is not a manufactured bioweapon or a lab-engineered virus. Las Plagas, a name that translates simply as the plagues in Spanish, is a genus of parasitic arthropods that evolved entirely on their own, long before human civilization had a word for them. Current estimates place the first plaga population in what would become rural Spain as far back as the Bronze Age, roughly 2,200 years before the Common Era. Some researchers within the lore go further, theorizing that the parasite may have existed since the Cambrian period, somewhere around 500 million years ago, preserved through long cycles of fossilization and dormancy. They are, in the truest sense, ancient things, organisms that have outlived entire kingdoms, geological ages, and countless species, quietly waiting in amber and stone for the next warm host to come close enough. The African connection. While Las Plagas are associated with rural Spain, evidence uncovered in later games, particularly Resident Evil 5, suggests that the parasite's geographic history stretches further than the Iberian Peninsula. Deep within the ruins of the Indipaya Kingdom in Western Africa, researchers discovered desiccated plaga remains alongside cave murals that clearly depicted the organisms being harvested and used to create primitive bioweapons. This means the parasite had been encountered and exploited by at least two separate ancient civilizations across different continents. How the organism migrated, or whether independent strains evolved separately in both regions, remains an open question in the lore, though one theory holds that the Indipaya discovered the parasite first, and that surviving specimens were eventually carried to Europe. Whatever the exact history, the Indipaya murals stand as some of the oldest known documentation of plaga interaction with humanity, predating the Salazar family's crusade by centuries. Sleeping in stone. One of the most striking biological facts about Las Plagas is their capacity for suspended animation. The parasite evolved the ability to enter a fossilized state within amber, the same golden tree resin that has preserved insects for millions of years, allowing them to survive indefinitely without a host. This is not a defense mechanism that the organism was engineered to have. It appears to be a naturally developed trait, one that allowed them to weather mass extinctions, ice ages, and long stretches of geological isolation without dying out. When the excavation workers beneath Salazar's castle disturbed these amber deposits at the start of Resident Evil 4's modern timeline, they unknowingly inhaled the fine desiccated spores of organisms that had lain dormant for centuries. Within days, those spores regenerated into fully formed parasites inside the workers' bodies. No syringe, no lab, no deliberate act of infection required. The three stages of a plaga. A plaga does not simply attach itself to a host and stay static. Once introduced into a human body, typically through an injected egg, the organism progresses through three distinct developmental stages, each named in Spanish. The first is guadaña, meaning scythe, a larval stage characterized by a long blade-like appendage. The second is mandibula, or jaw, a more developed form with hardened tentacles resembling fingers capable of gripping a human skull with crushing force. The third and most fearsome is araña, meaning Spider, a fully adult plaga that can operate semi-independently outside a host, spreading additional eggs and even attacking perceived threats directly. Most players who have experienced the horror of a headshot enemy revealing a writhing plaga behind the broken neck have encountered the guadaña stage, though the higher level forms are responsible for some of the most unsettling enemy designs in the entire franchise. Mind control through the nervous system. The mechanism by which Las Plagas exert control over their hosts is disturbingly clinical. Upon hatching inside a human body, a plaga works its way through soft tissue until it locates the host's spine or nervous system. It then latches onto the neural pathways there, essentially inserting itself as a secondary command structure between the brain and the body's motor functions. Lower-ranking hosts, the standard ganados, still retain the ability to speak, walk, use tools, and perform basic reasoning, but their impulses are overridden by the parasite's influence, which compels aggression, communal grouping, and obedience to hosts carrying dominant strain organisms. In practical terms, the plaga turns a person into something not quite a zombie and not quite themselves. A body still capable of wielding a chainsaw or throwing a pitchfork, but whose deeper drives belong entirely to the organism embedded in their flesh. The hive mind. What makes Las Plagas particularly terrifying from a tactical standpoint is that they do not control their hosts in isolation. Each plaga possesses a specialized sensory organ that detects and transmits high-frequency signals inaudible to the human ear, allowing the organisms within a group of ganados to communicate across significant distances. This creates something functionally close to a hive mind, a collective awareness that allows infected villagers to warn one another of intruders, coordinate attacks without verbal communication, and flood toward a threat from multiple directions simultaneously. Even without shouting or obvious signaling, a group of ganados will respond to a disturbance on the far side of a building because the parasites within them are already sharing the information. It is a quietly elegant horror. The body speaks one language, but the thing inside is having an entirely different conversation. The dominant species. Not all plagas are equal. Within the organism's social hierarchy sits a dominant strain variant that functions essentially as a queen, a species that forms a deeper, more symbiotic bond with its host, preserving higher cognitive function in exchange for granting the plaga more comprehensive control over the host's physiology. Hosts carrying a dominant strain plaga retain their intelligence, personality, and the ability to act with full agency. But the parasite also unlocks the capacity for grotesque physical transformation, enormous increases in strength, and, in extreme cases, total bodily mutation into something far beyond human. Osmond Sadler himself carried a dominant strain plaga, as did Ramon Salazar and Jack Krauser. This distinction between the walking, talking servants of Los Iluminados and the chainsaw-wielding ganados stumbling through the village is not just a matter of infection dose. It is a matter of which tier of the parasite's hierarchy found its way into the host. Weakness to light. For all their biological resilience, Las Plagas carry a fundamental vulnerability that shapes the entire strategic landscape of Resident Evil 4. Plaga tissue is destroyed on contact with ultraviolet radiation, meaning that direct sunlight, flash grenades, and lab-grade UV lamps are among the most effective tools against both the parasites and heavily infected hosts. This weakness is not incidental. It likely explains why the organisms spent so long sealed in caves and amber deposits beneath Salazar's castle. The subterranean environment protected them from exactly the kind of exposure that would kill them. It also quietly validates one of the game's most important lore beats. Ashley and Leon, once infected with Plaga eggs, can be cured before the organisms mature. Luis Serra's research identified this window of vulnerability, and the treatment involves a high-intensity UV exposure capable of killing the embryonic parasites before they reach the guadaña stage. The real-world parallel. Luis Serra's research notes, scattered across the early hours of the game, draw a deliberate and chilling comparison between Las Plagas and a real organism. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, a parasitic fungus that infects carpenter ants in tropical forests. The fungus hijacks the ant's nervous system, compelling it to climb to a precise height on a plant stem, bite down, and remain locked in place until the fungus is ready to release its spores from the dead host's body. The parallel to Las Plagas, an organism that overrides higher order behavior and uses a living body as a vehicle for its own propagation, is not subtle. Capcom's writers clearly drew on this real-world example to ground the fictional parasite in something viscerally plausible. What Luis's notes leave unspoken is the natural extension of that analogy, that the ganados shuffling through the village, obedient and purposeful, are performing a function no different than an ant clamped to a leaf, awaiting the moment they are no longer needed. The amber sample. In the remake version of Resident Evil 4, the MacGuffin that drives much of the central conflict is not simply a dominant plaga. It is a specimen preserved inside a piece of amber, and that distinction carries significant biological weight. Luis Serra's research had determined that this particular naturally occurring plaga, encased in ancient fossilized resin, possessed characteristics that exceeded even Sadler's artificially engineered dominant strain. Where Sadler's own plaga was a product of Los Illuminados' modern bioweapons research, modified and optimized over years of experimentation, the amber sample represented the parasite in its original unaltered form, and that form appeared to be stronger. Luis theorized that it could potentially override Sadler's plaga entirely, displacing his command authority over the infected population. This single specimen, small enough to carry in a coat pocket, posed a more fundamental threat to Sadler's power than anything Leon's weapons could offer. The cult that came before Sadler. Osmond. Sadler did not invent Los Illuminados. The cult has roots that stretch back to at least 1554, when a man named Adam Sadler, presumably an ancestor, was exploring the underground caves beneath what would become Salazar's castle, and first encountered the amber deposits containing the dormant plagas. Upon witnessing the organism's influence over other creatures, Adam Sadler came to believe that the parasites were remnants of a divine being, fragments of God itself scattered into the world. He built a heretical sect around this belief, recruiting followers through infection and positioning himself as a prophet interpreting the will of the organism. The cult grew powerful enough to attract violent suppression, eventually falling at the hands of Gregorio Salazar, the first Count of Valdelobos, who drove the infected followers out, killed or contained the ganados, and sealed the remaining plagas in the caves his family would then spend centuries guarding. Los Illuminados was not destroyed. It simply went underground, nursing its faith across generations and waiting for a Salazar who could be turned. Gregorio Salazar, the first Castellan. Before the diminutive, grey-faced Ramon Salazar became one of the most theatrically sinister villains in the franchise's history, his ancestor cast an entirely different shadow. Gregorio Salazar, referred to in local folklore as Gregorio the Conqueror, was a Catholic nobleman who launched a brutal military campaign against the Ganados occupying the region's mountain valleys. The remake dates this crusade to 1741, placing it squarely in the 18th century, though the original game's lore simply describes the first Castellan suppression of Los Iluminados as happening centuries before the present day. Cave art, found in the Wharf B caves beneath the estate, depicted Ganados performing human sacrificial rituals as far back as the Bronze Age, suggesting the cult and its practices had persisted for a very long time before Gregorio finally moved against them. He did not merely defeat the cult, he systematically dismantled it, sealed the Plaga population in the cavern network beneath his fortress, and constructed his castle directly atop the entrance, ensuring that his bloodline would serve as living guards over the containment site for as long as the family endured. He became a beloved figure in the region, his legacy a foundation of protection that Ramon would eventually invert entirely. A family built to guard a prison. The role of Castellan that Ramon Salazar inherited was never merely ceremonial. For every generation between Gregorio and Ramon, 7 full generations spanning several hundred years, the head of the Salazar family understood that their primary responsibility was containment. The castle was not just a noble residence, it was a prison built over a biological weapon. The Salazar family line maintained this vigil across centuries of Spanish history, through wars, religious upheaval, and political change, never releasing what lay below. That this duty ultimately failed not through some external force or dramatic assault, but through the manipulation of a lonely, terminally ill child who never had the chance to properly understand what he was protecting, is one of the quieter tragedies running beneath the game's surface. The Salazars spent 7 generations doing exactly what they were supposed to do, and it took 1 generation, one child with no parents and no guidance, to undo all of it. Ramon's illness and childhood. The Ramon Salazar player's encounter in Resident Evil 4 is, by the Japanese guidebook's account, only 20 years old, though his grey hair, withered skin, and frail frame suggest a body many decades older. The remake expands this detail into something more tragic. Ramon was born to Diego Salazar, the 7th Count of Valdelobos, and a woman named Catalina. From the earliest age, he suffered from a terminal illness that physicians expected would claim his life before adulthood. His mother, desperate, invited someone the household servants described only as a devil to cure her son, an invitation that, by most interpretations, brought Osman Sadler into the Salazar home under the guise of medicine. Sadler treated Ramon's illness by parasitizing him with a dominant strain Plaga, which physically restored the boy's body. But the cost was immediate. Ramon's father Diego was mysteriously killed not long after. Catalina vanished, and Ramon was left alone in his castle with no living family and no one to teach him the truth about what was buried beneath his own home. The man Ramon called father. With both of his parents gone and no relatives to take him in, Ramon Salazar inherited the castle and the Castellan title at an age when most children were still in school. His isolation was absolute. His only companion, for a time, was an elderly butler who would later transform under Plaga influence into the monstrous creature Pesanta in the remake's expanded narrative. Into this void stepped Osman Sadler, who had already cured the boy, already removed the people who might have warned him about Los Iluminados, and now offered the young Castellan something even more powerful than medicine: belonging. Ramon came to see Sadler as a surrogate father, the only significant adult presence in his life. Sadler framed the Salazar family, legacy not as protection but as sin, told Ramon that his ancestors had wronged the world by sealing the plagas, that undoing their work was an act of redemption. This is the architecture of the manipulation. Take away everyone a child might trust, then offer yourself as the only remaining truth. The excavation that unleashed everything. Once Ramon had fully accepted Sadler's ideology, the practical steps toward catastrophe were straightforward. Ramon hired a workforce of local villagers to excavate the cave network beneath his castle, instructing them to remove the sealed barriers his ancestor had spent his entire life constructing. The workers discovered what appeared to be mummified, desiccated remains of the plaga organisms, and the initial assumption was that the parasites had simply died during their long confinement. They had not. The dried carcasses had released dormant spores into the cave air, and the workers inhaled them in the course of their labor. Over the following weeks and months, those spores regenerated inside their bodies into fully formed plagas. One by one, the excavation crew became ganados, the first wave of a population-wide infection that would eventually claim the entire village of Valdelobos and the surrounding region. The cave had not been a tomb. It had been an incubator. Sadler's true background. Osmund Sadler is positioned by the game as Los Illuminados' 15th prophet, the latest in a line of cult leaders descending from Adam Sadler's original founding vision in 1554. His precise biography before his arrival in Valdelobos is deliberately obscured, but what the lore does confirm is that Sadler was already a trained bioweapons researcher before he approached the Salazar family. He came to the region not purely as a believer, but as someone who recognized the scientific and political potential of a parasite that could override human autonomy. Whether his faith in Los Illuminados is genuine, whether he truly believed the organism to be divine, is left deliberately ambiguous. One account describes him as seeing both the cult and the plaga as tools for his personal enrichment and power. Another suggests that, as a legitimate descendant of the cult's founding lineage, he may have genuinely embraced its theology. The infection itself may have further shifted his perception, since even dominant strain hosts in the remake are noted to suffer gradual personality corruption. Sadler's plan for world domination. What Sadler intended to do with Las Plagas was not abstract ideology. It was a remarkably specific and patient political strategy. Ashley Graham, the daughter of the sitting United States President, was kidnapped not for ransom or leverage, but for infection. Once implanted with a plaga egg, Ashley would be returned to her father apparently unharmed. The parasite would mature inside her body during the journey home, and upon her return to Washington, she would begin spreading plaga spores to anyone in proximity, including the President of the United States and anyone else in the executive circle. With the most powerful government on Earth under parasitic control, Los Illuminados would hold leverage over American foreign policy, military capability, and global influence. The plan's elegance lies in its simplicity. Rather than a frontal assault on American power, Sadler intended to walk a warm, smiling carrier right through the front door of the White House. Ashley Graham and the kidnapping. Ashley Graham was not a random target. While the law never explicitly confirms that her bloodline carried any special biological property, the cult's belief system apparently held that her specific connection to the American presidency made her the most effective possible vector for spreading plaga influence to the most powerful decision-makers in the world. The kidnapping itself was a sophisticated operation. Jack Krauser, operating on behalf of Los Illuminados, coordinated a team that staged a vehicle breakdown with Ashley's transport car, transferred her to a separate vehicle under sedation, and arranged a distraction operation to disable the investigation network tracking her disappearance. By the time American intelligence agencies had pieced together what happened, Ashley was already in Spain. Leon S. Kennedy was dispatched with minimal intelligence and a single handgun, assigned to a mountainous region in rural Europe, with the code name for Ashley, Baby Eagle, and almost nothing else. Leon before the mission. The version of Leon Kennedy, who arrives in that rain-wet Spanish village in August 2004, is not the wide-eyed rookie who stumbled into Raccoon City 6 years earlier. He is 26 years old, and the intervening years have been spent under government training so demanding that multiple accounts describe it as transformative. Stripping away the naivety of the RPD officer who survived a zombie apocalypse and replacing it with something more controlled, more efficient, and more deliberately cold. The government did not invite Leon into their program. They conscripted him. Following the Raccoon City destruction incident, Leon was apprehended by U.S. military personnel, along with the other survivors, separated from Claire Redfield, and presented with what his file describes as an offer he could not refuse: become an agent of a classified anti-bioterrorism unit, or face an unspecified alternative. Leon agreed, and spent the next several years being shaped into one of the most capable operatives in the government's arsenal. Leon's training under Krauser. In the remake's continuity, the man most directly responsible for turning Leon into the agent he becomes is Major Jack Krauser, not a peer, but a superior, someone who served as mentor, drill instructor, and the closest thing Leon had to a commanding officer during his years of classified preparation. Krauser ran Leon through close quarters, combat, weapons handling, physical conditioning, and tactical decision-making exercises that the law describes as pushing recruits to breaking points. Most did not survive intact. The relationship between them was not warm. Krauser's approach to instruction was methodical and demanding, treating Leon as a project rather than a person, but it was formative. When Leon eventually faces Krauser in the ruins of Los Iluminados' island base, and Krauser tells him he fights like a rookie, it carries a specific weight. This is the man who decided what level of fighter Leon was allowed to become, and who now dismisses the result as insufficient. That dismissal is its own kind of cruelty. Operation Javier and the Fracture. The event that broke Jack Krauser and began his long descent toward Los Iluminados was a classified mission in 2002 called Operation Javier, conducted in an unnamed South American country within the Amazon rainforest. In the original game's continuity, Krauser participated alongside Leon. In the remake, the operation involved Krauser leading an entire unit of elite soldiers into the jungle to destroy a drug cartel with ties to Umbrella's bioweapons market. The mission succeeded, the cartel was neutralized, but the cost was total. Every soldier under Krauser's command was killed, and Krauser himself sustained a severe injury to his left arm that military physicians determined would never fully heal. The government's response to the disaster was a cover-up. The operation was classified. The deaths were quietly attributed to other causes, and the survivors, Krauser among them, were given no acknowledgement, no recognition, and no meaningful support. The message Krauser received was clear. Your men were expendable, and so are you. Krauser's ideology of power. What Operation Javier planted in Krauser was not simply bitterness, it was an ideological reorientation. During the mission, deep in a drug lord's mansion surrounded by the evidence of what viruses and bioweapons could do to the human body, Krauser encountered T. veronica, a strain derived from the Veronica virus, and watched in a state of growing fascination as infected subjects demonstrated physical capabilities that no unmodified human could match. The drug lord Javier Hidalgo had come to believe that the virus represented the next stage of human capability, that strength, not morality or loyalty, was the only currency that mattered in a world that had already demonstrated its willingness to discard him. Krauser found himself agreeing. By the time he walked out of the jungle as the sole survivor of a classified disaster, he had developed a philosophy. Power was the only protection that existed, and the government's willingness to abandon his unit proved that the institutions he had served meant nothing. He began looking for another source of power entirely. Krauser's plugger mutation, Jack Krauser's left arm, damaged during Operation Javier and never properly healed, becomes something else entirely by the time Leon encounters him in Resident Evil 4. Krauser was given a dominant species plaga by Sadler as reward for his service to Los Illuminados, and the organism worked its modifications through the already compromised limb, transforming it into a structure that defies easy description. The arm itself becomes capable of reshaping in real time, its surface hardening and expanding into a blade-like shield of organic tissue that can deflect incoming fire, cleave through obstacles, and drive into Leon with the force of something far beyond a human punch. In the original game's mechanics, Krauser can trigger a full mutation of this limb during combat. In the remake, the transformation is more sustained, a visible symptom of how thoroughly the plaga has integrated with his body. It is worth noting that Krauser retained his full intelligence and personality throughout this process, which is precisely what the dominant strain is designed to permit. The body transforms. The will, such as it is, remains intact. The connection between Krauser and Ashley's kidnapping. Krauser's role in the broader conspiracy runs deeper than simply being Sadler's enforcer. In the original game, Krauser had infiltrated Los Illuminados under the orders of Albert Wesker, tasked with obtaining a dominant strain plaga sample for Wesker's unnamed organization. To gain Sadler's trust completely, he organized the kidnapping of Ashley Graham himself, coordinating the operation, disabling her protection, and ensuring her safe transfer to Spain and subsequent infection. In other words, the entire chain of events that drives Resident Evil 4's plot, Leon's mission, Ashley's captivity, the infection of the village, the confrontation with Sadler, was set in motion by a man whose ultimate loyalty was not to Los Illuminados at all, but to a bioterrorist who wanted the parasite for purposes Sadler never fully grasped. In the remake, Krauser's motivations shift slightly. He joins the cult of his own accord rather than as Wesker's plant. But the structural truth remains. Ashley's kidnapping was engineered. Ada Wong's real name. Ada Wong is not a name. It is a cover identity. A pseudonym so thoroughly maintained that even within the Resident Evil franchise's extensive lore documentation, her actual name, birth date, nationality, and personal history before her career in espionage remain entirely unknown. What the lore does confirm is that she is of Chinese-American descent, that she is an exceptionally skilled operative trained in several martial arts styles, including wushu and savate, and that she has been operating in the corporate spy ecosystem long enough to have established relationships with multiple competing factions simultaneously. She first appears under this alias in Resident Evil 2, already deep into a mission for an unnamed organization, and her use of the pseudonym predates that encounter. The name Ada Wong is not the beginning of her story. It is simply the layer she shows the world, and she has never shown anything else. Ada's employer and the double cross. By the events of Resident Evil 4, Ada is nominally working for Albert Wesker and the unnamed organization he represents, a rival company to Umbrella, engaged in the same bioweapons market, but operating with different methods and different long-term goals. Her stated mission is to retrieve a sample of the dominant strain Plaga and its associated research data. What she does not tell Wesker, and what the Separate Ways storyline reveals, is that her actual loyalty lies not with him, but with a separate faction within the same organization. One that distrusts Wesker, correctly suspecting that he intends to use whatever sample he acquires, not for the organization's benefit, but for his own purposes. Ada's presence in Spain is effectively a double operation. She is there on Wesker's behalf, while simultaneously working to ensure that what Wesker receives is not the most valuable sample, but a controlled substitute. The Plaga she eventually delivers to him is recessive rather than dominant, functional enough to satisfy a surface review, but not what he actually needed. The bell that saved Leon. One of the most significant moments in the opening sequence of Resident Evil 4 passes without explanation if you are not paying close attention. Leon arrives in the village, is immediately beset by an enormous mob of ganados who seem intent on killing him outright, and then, just as the situation reaches its most desperate peak, the village church bell begins to toll. Every ganado in the area stops, turns toward the sound, and walks away, leaving Leon standing alone in the square surrounded by torches and barely contained chaos. The game presents this as a simple cult response to a signal, and moves on. What Separate Ways reveals is that the bell was rung by Ada Wong, who had been monitoring Leon's situation and chose, against her operational interest and against direct orders, to save his life at that moment. She rang the bell, she created the escape, and she never told him. Ada's order to kill Leon. At a critical point during Ada's mission in Valdelobos, Albert Wesker contacts her directly and issues an instruction. Kill Leon Kennedy. His reasoning is operational. Leon's presence is a complication, a variable that could interfere with the Plaga extraction, and eliminating him would simplify the mission. Ada does not comply. She finds a reason to avoid the order without technically disobeying it, telling Wesker she had no opportunity, or positioning herself in ways that ensure she cannot take the shot. Wesker eventually reverses the order himself, recognizing that Leon's disruption of Los Iluminados' operations is actually useful for creating openings Ada can exploit. But the moment itself is telling. Ada Wong is a woman who can kill without apparent hesitation when the mission requires it. The fact that she repeatedly declines to kill Leon, despite orders, despite opportunity, despite the professional cost, is the closest the franchise has ever come to confirming that the dynamic between them is something more than operational history. Ramon Salazar was only 20 years old. Among the stranger lore facts surrounding Resident Evil 4 is the confirmation, printed in Famitsu's official Biohazard 4 guide published in Japan, that Ramon Salazar, the white-haired, deeply wrinkled, frail-bodied castellan of the most imposing castle in rural Spain, was 20 years old at the time of his death. His appearance in the original game suggests a man several decades further into his life, and the disconnect is jarring once you know the number. The dominant Plaga he received as a child, which cured his terminal illness and saved his life, also clearly did something to his physical development, accelerating the aging process, distorting the normal progression of a human body in ways that manifested outwardly as premature senility. He stood as a young man in an old body, ruling a castle that had swallowed his family's history, and leaving behind the name of someone who looked ancient but had barely lived at all. In the remake, this tragic arithmetic is made more explicit through the documents and artifacts scattered through his castle. Salazar's cruelty before the Plaga. It would be easy to attribute Ramon Salazar's monstrosity entirely to Osman Sadler's influence and the parasite's personality-corrupting effects, but the remake's expanded lore makes clear that cruelty was already present in the boy before either of those factors took hold. As a young adolescent, Rahman overheard a household servant referring to him behind his back as pulgarcito, a Spanish term meaning something like Tom Thumb, a diminutive insult directed at his small stature. His response was to invite the servant to his private chambers and pour vitriol, a caustic acid, directly onto her face. The act was witnessed by members of the household who were horrified by it, including a housekeeper, who later became the creature known as Pesanta. It reveals that the isolation and manipulation Sadler provided did not create Salazar's darkness so much as find it waiting, already formed, and give it a direction. Ramon killed his own father. The remake's documentation of the Salazar family history contains a detail of particular darkness. Ramon's father, Diego Salazar, referred to with the epithet the Severe, apparently underwent a shift in his perception of his son after the cult's influence began to penetrate the castle. During a confrontation, Diego reportedly called Ramon a demon child and threatened to send him back to hell, declaring that Ramon should never have been born. The confrontation ended with Ramon killing his father and subsequently assuming the full title of Count Salazar. Players who explore the throne room in the remake can find Diego's portrait on the wall with a knife buried in it, an artifact Leon can remove and take with him. Whether the portrait detail reflects something Ramon did in the immediate aftermath of the killing, or something that accumulated over years of resentment, is left to the reader's interpretation. It is quietly one of the darkest objects in a game filled with dark objects. The castle's real art, Salazar Castle, is not simply a backdrop for encounter design. The remake, following the original game's practice, populated its halls with reproductions of significant works from European art history, used as environmental details throughout the castle's opulent rooms. In the room containing an accessible rocket launcher surrounded by glass, the wall behind it features a reproduction of The School of Athens by the Italian Renaissance master Raphael, a painting depicting the great philosophers of antiquity engaged in discourse, hung in a room designed to kill intruders. In the bedroom, where Leon encounters Ada for the first time during the original game, La Primavera by Sandro Botticelli, painted in 1482, hangs on the wall. These inclusions were not accidental. The development team traveled through Spain, England, and Wales, photographing Gothic architecture and period details, and the art choices throughout the castle were selected deliberately to place the horror in a context of genuine cultural history. The Regenerators were born from research. Among the most frightening enemies in Resident Evil 4 are the Regenerators, slow-moving, heavily built creatures capable of rapidly regenerating damage to their bodies, healing around bullets almost as fast as Leon can fire them. Their in-game lore description, confirmed by the game's designer Kobayashi, describes them as byproducts of Los Illuminados' bioweapons research. experimental subjects implanted with multiple Plaga parasites simultaneously during early experimentation with the organism. The result was a host that the parasites essentially rebuilt from the inside, reorganizing organic structure to allow rapid cellular regeneration. The Iron Maidens, the female variant that additionally generates spikes when approached, represent a further iteration of the same process, with the Plaga integration reaching a level that begins producing novel physical structures rather than simply healing existing damage. Shinji Mikami described the Regeneradors as an intentional design choice to preserve the survival horror atmosphere in a game trending toward action, providing an enemy type that could not simply be handled through superior firepower. El Gigante and the limits of the parasite. El Gigante, the enormous, boulder-throwing creature that Leon encounters in the village, represents a different category of Plaga application than the standard Ganados, or even the Regeneradors. Its Plaga integration drove the organism to a size that bears almost no resemblance to a normal human being. The lore implies that the dramatic increase in physical scale was a consequence of the parasite pushing against the limits of what a human body could structurally support, triggering runaway growth responses. The intelligence of the host dropped accordingly. El Gigante exhibits almost no reasoning capability, responding to stimuli rather than executing strategies. Its Plaga, when exposed on its back, is fully visible and vulnerable, which is where the organism's higher coordination functions appear to have consolidated. Killing the parasite kills the host. What El Gigante represents in the broader logic of Las Plagas is the ceiling of what the organism can do to a body when strength is maximized and cognition is sacrificed. The Novistadors. The Novistadors, the insect-like, cloaking creatures that infest the castle's hedge maze and sewers, are among the most biologically creative applications of Las Plagas in the entire game. They are not humans infected with the parasite. They are human-animal hybrids, the result of Los Iluminados' research team grafting Plaga biology onto existing insect physiology to produce an entirely new category of organism. The name Novistador roughly translates to one who does not see, or alternatively, to a corruption of spy in Spanish. A reference to their cloaking capability, which allows them to render themselves nearly invisible to the naked eye. They operate as Sadler's covert enforcers, the parasite's most sophisticated manufactured creature, and their existence demonstrates that Los Iluminados was not simply infecting humans and waiting to see what happened. It was conducting active biological research into hybrid organism development. The Verdugo, Ramon Salazar's two personal bodyguards, the Verdugos, represent the apex of what a dominant strain Plaga can do to a human host who is also heavily modified through additional biological engineering. The word Verdugo in Spanish means executioner or hangman, and the creatures embody that function with an unsettling elegance. They retain the ability to taunt opponents verbally, demonstrate fierce loyalty to Salazar as their designated master, and display tactical intelligence during combat, circling, flanking, retreating when overwhelmed. Their bodies have been heavily altered beyond the standard Plaga integration, with exoskeletal plating and limb modifications that suggest additional intervention beyond simply introducing the parasite. Leon can exploit their extreme vulnerability to temperature, specifically to liquid nitrogen, which flash freezes their enhanced physiology and renders them immobile. The cold weakness is a quietly brilliant detail. Creatures engineered for killing in the enclosed warmth of a castle find their one fatal exposure in something as simple as a sudden change in temperature, the Garradors, and sound. The Garradors, chainsaw-clawed plaga hosts found chained in the castle's lower sections, offer one of the game's most tactically interesting enemy designs, precisely because their plaga integration destroyed one faculty while enhancing another. The organisms implanted in their bodies drove a level of aggression so extreme that the Garradors' eyes were surgically removed to prevent them from attacking allies indiscriminately. What the surgery left behind was a hypersensitive auditory system. The hosts now navigate entirely through sound, detecting footsteps, weapon fire, and movement across the dungeon floor with precision that compensates for their complete blindness. Every room in the castle where Leon encounters a Garrador contains bells installed in the walls and ceiling. This is not decoration. The bells are tools deliberately placed by someone who understood that the creatures would run toward any loud noise. Knowing the Garrador's limitation does not make the room safer. It simply converts the threat from environmental to operational. Bitores Mendez, the village chief. Of all the plaga-infected characters in Resident Evil 4, Bitores Mendez, the hulking, black-coated village chief who first encounters Leon in the village square, carries perhaps the most complex biological status in the game's lore. He is something between a standard dominant strain host and a full mutation subject, a man whose plaga integration has clearly advanced further than a typical infected villager, but whose cognition is sufficiently intact that he operates as a community leader and religious authority for the ganados around him. His spine, visible during his final confrontation, has become a jointed, extendable structure, a plaga modification that allows his body to literally separate at the midsection and reconstitute around Leon as a trap. In the remake, his plaga has reached a state where the organism visibly emerges from his neck during combat, his control over the parasite, and the parasite's control over him having merged into something the lore treats as genuinely unprecedented, even within Los Illuminados' experience. The merchant has no explanation. Among the persistent mysteries of Resident Evil 4's lore is the identity and nature of the merchant, the robed figure who appears at regular intervals throughout the village, castle, and island, offering to buy, sell, and tune up Leon's equipment. He is not identified by name in either the original game or the remake. His dialogue is entirely transactional. He appears in locations that suggest he moves through the environment freely and without fear, setting up shop in caves, abandoned buildings, and enemy-held corridors without any of the surrounding ganados touching him. The lore offers no explanation for this immunity. He sells weapons to Leon with the same apparent neutrality with which he might sell them to anyone else. Some community theories suggest he may be operating as an independent arms dealer who has maintained enough of a relationship with multiple factions to remain untouchable. Others suggest he may carry a plaga infection that grants him cult recognition without subjugating his autonomy. The game, across all its versions, declines to say. What he is precisely remains unknown. Devil May Cry began as Resident Evil 4. The chaotic development history of Resident Evil 4 is one of gaming's most documented origin stories, beginning with the fact that an entirely different franchise was born from its earliest prototype. In 1999, series creator Shinji Mikami handed development of Resident Evil 4 to Hideki Kamiya, whose team built a version of the game centered on a stylish, practically invincible protagonist named Tony, a character with superhuman abilities derived from biotechnology, designed to look and feel as far from the cautious, vulnerable protagonist of earlier Resident Evil games as possible. The game used a dynamic camera system rather than fixed angles and prioritized acrobatic action over survival tension. Mikami reviewed the build and concluded that while it was an impressive game, it was not a Resident Evil game. Rather than scrap the work entirely, he encouraged Kamiya to continue it as a separate project. That project became Devil May Cry, released for PlayStation 2 in 2001, and Resident Evil 4 development began again from scratch. The Fog version. When Resident Evil 4 restarted following the separation of Kamiya's prototype, the first new build was a project commonly referred to by fans as the Fog version or Castle version, developed under director Hiroshi Shibata from 2001 to 2002. This iteration kept Leon Kennedy as the protagonist, but placed him in a fundamentally different setting. The castle headquarters of Umbrella Corporation's European branch, tied to the organization's founder Oswell E. Spencer. The narrative would have explored the origins of the progenitor virus and Spencer's pursuit of immortality, serving as a more direct continuation of the existing story thread. A central enemy in this version was Black Fog, a floating mass of dark tentacles intended to serve as a persistent pursuer. The build ran into significant programming difficulties. The development team struggled both with rendering the fog creature convincingly and with broader technical challenges on the GameCube hardware. And the build was approximately 40% complete when it was abandoned. Its script was donated to another development team, where it eventually became the foundation for a different Capcom horror game, Haunting Ground. The Hookman version, the iteration of Resident Evil 4 that fans remember most vividly from its cancelled state, is the build commonly called the Hookman version, or the Hallucination version, showcased at E3 2003, with a trailer that Shinji Mikami personally introduced by telling the audience not to pee their pants. This version placed Leon in a derelict, haunted building and introduced a central antagonist unlike anything in the franchise's history. A ghost-like figure trailing a massive iron hook and wrapped in shifting shadows, capable of appearing and disappearing without warning. Leon would hallucinate enemies, animated dolls, distorted creatures, as a consequence of an infection altering his perception, and the design blurred the line between environmental threat and psychological horror in ways that felt genuinely new for the series. The Hookman himself could only be disrupted by Leon's flashlight or by lightning strikes. Writer Yasuhisa Kawamura, who developed the concept, later described feeling ashamed that Mikami ultimately had to set it aside, and one fan developer spent years reconstructing playable sections of the build as a project called Code Madman. The zombie version and the final rebuild. After the Hookman build was rejected in late 2003, a fourth version of Resident Evil 4 entered brief development under the working title Zombie version, an attempt to return to the franchise's most fundamental element by reintroducing traditional undead enemies referred to internally as Dabbermen. The concept was abandoned after only a few months. The consensus among the development team was that a return to zombies would feel retrograde after everything the franchise had already done, and that the audience who had watched Resident Evil grow through multiple entries would be frustrated rather than comforted by the familiar threat. Shinji Mikami then took over as director himself, described by accounts as an emergency measure by Capcom management, and led a compressed final development period in which the Ganados, Las Plagas, the village castle island structure, and the over-the-shoulder camera system were all developed and implemented. The game that launched on GameCube in January 2005 was built almost entirely within that final push. The research team behind Spain. One of the most quietly impressive facts about Resident Evil 4's production is that the development team at Capcom Production Studio 4 committed to genuine location research before building the game's environments. Mikami's team spent 11 days in Spain and the United Kingdom, photographing Gothic architecture, stone pavements, castle interiors, and religious iconography. The photographs they brought back were used as texture references for surfaces throughout the game. The worn flagstones of the castle courtyards, the mossy stone of the village walls, the stained glass and vaulted ceilings of the church. The castle's architecture drew on both Spanish and Welsh castle structures, and the village environments reflected a studied understanding of rural Iberian architectural patterns. This is one of the reasons the game's environments feel inhabited rather than manufactured. They are built from documented observation of real places, not assembled from generic fantasy castle components. The over-the-shoulder camera came from a different game, the fundamental camera innovation that defines Resident Evil 4. The dynamic over-the-shoulder perspective that positioned the camera directly behind Leon during exploration and zoomed in closer during aiming was inspired not by an earlier horror game, but by an action title, Onimusha 3. Demon Siege, a 2004 game featuring samurai action set across feudal Japan and modern Paris. Mikami had been playing Onimusha 3 and found himself frustrated by its fixed camera angles during combat, feeling that the sense of spatial ownership and threat response was limited by being unable to see the playable character's relationship to enemies in real time. He decided to solve that problem himself by placing the camera behind Leon and allowing the player to see and manage space the way a real person might assess a dangerous environment. The result changed not only Resident Evil, but the genre conventions of third-person action games for years afterward, establishing a perspective template that dozens of subsequent games adopted. The laser sight and what it changed. In Resident Evil games prior to the fourth entry, aiming was handled through a targeting reticle that expanded and contracted based on movement, but gave players relatively little spatial precision in choosing exactly where a shot would land. Resident Evil 4 replaced this system with a physical laser sight, a red dot visible in the game world, projecting from Leon's weapon and landing precisely on whatever surface was in his line of sight. This was not purely a mechanical convenience. It fundamentally changed the relationship between player attention and enemy anatomy. Shooting a ganado in the knee to stagger it, placing a shot in a specific enemy's weapon-holding arm to disarm them, targeting the precise location on a plaga host where the organism was visible. All of these interactions became available because the laser sight made the player's intent legible in three-dimensional space. The system was so effective at producing satisfying tactical decisions that it became standard in action-oriented shooters across the industry within a few years. Leon's gun has a name engraved on it. Leon's default handgun in the remake of Resident Evil 4, the SG-09R, carries an engraving that most players will miss entirely unless they examine the weapon's model closely. The name Kendo. This is a direct reference to Robert Kendo, the owner of gun shop Kendo in Raccoon City, an arms dealer who appeared briefly but memorably in Resident Evil 2 before being overwhelmed by the outbreak. The in-game implication is that Leon purchased his starting weapon from Kendo's shop sometime during or after the Raccoon City incident, before the shop was destroyed along with the city. It is a detail with essentially no practical significance to the gameplay. A piece of texture on a weapon model that the vast majority of players will never notice. It is also a deeply considered piece of world building that quietly insists the fictional world has continuity, that objects have origins, and that this particular gun had a previous owner, whose fate the player may already know. The Matilda, named after a movie character. The Matilda handgun, available for purchase in Resident Evil 4, carries a name that is a direct reference not to the Resident Evil universe, but to a 1994 film. Léon, the Professional, directed by Luc Besson, and featuring Jean Reno as a contract killer named Léon, who forms an unlikely protective relationship with a young girl named Matilda, played by Natalie Portman, was clearly an influence on the design of Leon Kennedy as a character. The naming of a firearm after Portman's character is one of several quiet signals that the creative team working on Resident Evil 4 were conscious of the film's thematic DNA running through their protagonist, a man of violence who ends up protecting someone who cannot protect themselves, navigating a hostile world on a mission that is both professional and personal. The Killer 7 Magnum, available later in the game, is similarly named, this time after the Capcom game Killer 7, developed by Grasshopper Manufacture and Capcom in the same era. Ashley's armor breaks Leon's back. One of the most quietly charming mechanical details in Resident Evil 4 involves Ashley Graham's unlockable armor costume, a full suit of articulated metal plate that renders her essentially immune to bullet damage and makes her impossible for Granados to carry away. Players who unlock and use this costume will notice an additional animation that triggers whenever Leon catches Ashley as she falls from a ledge or ladder. He visibly staggers under the weight of the armor, clutching his back with an expression of pained surprise. The animation serves no mechanical purpose. It does not slow Leon down or apply a damage penalty, but it exists entirely to acknowledge that catching an adult human being wearing a full set of medieval plate armor would, in the real world, cause significant physical distress. Capcom's attention to this particular detail is the kind of small, unnecessary honesty that players who pay close attention to animation work tend to treasure. Ashley quotes Jill Valentine. During Chapter 14 of the remake, Leon boosts Ashley through a small opening so she can access and unlock a gate on the other side. After successfully completing the task and rejoining Leon, Ashley delivers a line that longtime Resident Evil fans will recognize immediately. She remarks that she's pretty much a master of unlocking. This is a direct callback to one of the most beloved and unintentionally comedic lines in the franchise's history, Barry Burton's description of Jill Valentine in the original Resident Evil from 1996, delivered with enough earnestness to become a meme that the community has sustained across it nearly 3 decades. The remake includes it not as pure nostalgia bait, but as a character beat. Ashley has been through enough at this point to earn a moment of dark humor, and the quote functions as a small bridge between a frightened girl at the beginning of her ordeal and someone who has developed enough resilience to make jokes about it. The throne room secret. In both the original Resident Evil 4 and the remake, Salazar's castle contains a throne room with an opulent carved seat positioned at the end of a long, formally arranged chamber. Both games allow Leon to walk up to the throne and interact with it, triggering a short cutscene in which he settles himself into the seat with an ease that suggests he finds the whole arrangement more amusing than impressive. The game then displays a text message on screen. There's no time for resting. It is a small thing, a cosmetic interaction that does nothing for progression or resources, but it persisted from the original through the remake because it captures something true about Leon's character. the ability to acknowledge absurdity without losing focus, a government agent halfway through a mission that has involved chainsaw-wielding villagers, a castle full of religious fanatics, and an infected parasite growing inside his body, pausing briefly to sit on a dictator's throne and shrug at the world. The interaction is, in its small way, perfect. The Ditman glitch and its legacy. Before the remake existed, the original Resident Evil 4 was kept alive and endlessly replayed in significant part through its speedrunning community, which discovered and refined a movement exploit known as the Ditman glitch, named after the community member who identified it. By opening the inventory at a specific moment while aiming the striker shotgun and then switching to a different weapon, players could trick the game's engine into applying the running animation speed of a shotgun pump to Leon's normal walking state, dramatically increasing his movement speed for as long as the exploit was maintained. It became foundational to speedrun routes, allowing players to navigate sections of the game in a fraction of the intended time. When Capcom developed the remake, they included a quiet acknowledgement of this community discovery. One of the attaché case charms available as an unlock specifically grants Leon an 8% increase to movement speed, a direct, intentional nod to the glitch that kept the original game's community active for years. The mid-credits scene. The remake of Resident Evil 4 follows the modern franchise convention of including post-credit content, and both of its credit sequences carry lore significance. The mid-credit scene depicts Ada Wong in her helicopter, now airborne and away from the island explosion. She is on a call with Albert Wesker and the Las Plagas sample. The objective that drove the entire mission is visible in her hand. The scene confirms that Wesker received what he asked for, setting up the chain of events that will eventually feed into Resident Evil 5's plot. But in the context of the remake's Separate Ways DLC, which shows Ada actively defying Wesker in the game's final moments after learning the full scope of his intentions, the mid-credits framing becomes more ambiguous. Is this the recessive sample she substituted, or did she ultimately deliver the dominant strain? The scene provides confirmation of delivery but not of what was delivered, and the franchise does not fully close the gap. The merchant returns in the remake for a reason. One detail that becomes apparent on close attention to the remake's handling of the merchant is that his presence in specific locations correlates meaningfully with narrative beats rather than appearing random. He consistently positions himself in the immediate aftermath of major set pieces, just outside the village church after the bells scene, in the caves below the castle, at rest points on the island. Some community analysis suggests he may be tracking Leon's progress specifically, rather than simply operating his business in places where there is foot traffic. The most discussed fan theory proposes that the merchant has some prior relationship with either the government or with one of the intelligence organizations operating in the region, that his neutrality is not incidental but maintained, and that his willingness to arm Leon specifically is not entirely commercial. It could also be inferred from the placement of his shop stalls that he has advanced knowledge of where Leon will end up, which would imply someone is feeding him information. The game does not confirm any of this, and Capcom has deliberately kept him unexplained across every version. He remains, as the franchise intends him to remain, a mystery with good prices and excellent timing. Luis was born in the village. He helped destroy. One of the quieter tragedies threaded through Resident Evil 4's lore is that Luis Serra, the charming, quietly guilt-ridden researcher who becomes Leon's most important ally, was born and raised in Valdelobos itself, the very village the Plaga outbreak has consumed. He grew up there before a larger world pulled him away, and when he eventually returned as an adult, he came back into a place he had helped, through his own research, make far more dangerous. His mother died in childbirth. His grandfather, a hunter who knew the forests and mountain paths intimately and passed that knowledge to the young Luis, later contracted an illness. The village's response, steeped in the same medieval superstition that made it vulnerable to Sadler's influence, was not medicine. It was the former village chief ordering the house burned down with the grandfather still inside. Luis stood outside and watched it happen, and then walked away from Valdelobos without looking back. That departure, born from grief and horror at his own community, was the beginning of the road that eventually led him back to the same place, carrying different horrors entirely. Luis and the Nemesis connection. In the remake's continuity, Luis Serra's history before Valdelobos is darker than the original game suggests. After leaving his village and eventually becoming a world-class biologist, his talent attracted the attention of the Umbrella Corporation, which recruited him first to develop pharmaceutical products, all of which were discontinued before reaching market, and then brought him into something far more significant: Umbrella Europe's sixth laboratory, one of the company's premier research divisions. The specific project that division was working on involved a parasite engineered to limit the cognitive deterioration caused by T-virus infection, a creature that could control a host without destroying the host's operational capacity. That research eventually produced the NE-alpha parasite, which was used to create the Nemesis T-type. A photograph found in Luis's island laboratory in the remake shows him standing with colleagues under a banner reading Europe Laboratory 6 Dream Team. Luis Serra, who dies in rural Spain, helping Leon fight a parasite cult, helped create Nemesis. The weight of what he built and what it was used for is part of why he found it so hard to simply walk away from Sadler's research once he understood what it was for. Luis designed the suppressor himself. One of Luis's most practically significant contributions to the events of Resident Evil 4 is a suppressant medication he developed during his time with Los Iluminados' research program. Having received instructions from Sadler to investigate the parasite's weaknesses, ostensibly so the cult could engineer more resilient strains, though Luis came to suspect the real purpose was giving Sadler intelligence on how to remove plagas from his own body if needed. Luis developed a chemical compound capable of inhibiting the plaga's growth cycle. He administered a dose to himself before attempting to flee with the amber sample, which is why Mendez could not simply have him re-injected when he was captured. The parasite in Luis's body was suppressed before it could be replaced. When he finally reunites with Leon in the castle, the pills he presses into Leon's hands before dying are the product of this same research, a compound that buys both Leon and Ashley the time they need to reach the removal device on the island. It is a final act of genuine penance from a man who spent years building exactly the threat he was now helping undo. Don Quixote and Luis's self-image. The remake version of Luis Serra carries a specific literary identity that the original game only hints at. He makes repeated references to Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote throughout the game, calling Leon his squire Sancho Panza, referring to Ashley as Princess Dulcinea, framing his own mission in the language of a knight-errant tilting at windmills. On one level, these are the jokes of a witty man deflecting from the seriousness of what he faces. On another level, they are entirely sincere. Don Quixote is a story about a man who reads too many tales of noble adventure and convinces himself he is living inside one, whose delusions of chivalric heroism lead him into genuine acts of courage and genuine suffering, and ultimately, a kind of tragic dignity. Luis knows exactly what he is doing with the parallel. He spent years building weapons for the wrong side. He does not get to be the hero from the beginning of the story, but perhaps he can be the hero at the end of it, even if the end comes too soon. The literary reference is not decoration. It is the key to understanding what Luis thinks he is owed and what he believes he deserves. Ashley's character was redesigned twice. Ashley Graham's role in Resident Evil 4 has a development history almost as complicated as the game itself. Early records indicate that in some of the prototype builds, a female character similar to Ashley was intended to be a fully playable protagonist, a separate player character with her own combat capabilities, and a dog companion described as a biological weapon in her care. When that version was abandoned, Ashley's role was restructured into the companion design that became iconic. A character the player must protect and escort, whose vulnerability creates the central tension of much of the game's second and third acts. The 2005 version of Ashley received significant critical pushback for her characterization. Perceived as passive, prone to screaming, and defined almost entirely by needing to be saved. The remake team specifically cited expanding Ashley and deepening her relationship with Leon as a primary development goal. In the remake, she cannot be left alone, demonstrates active agency in several sequences, and the arc between her and Leon functions as a genuine narrative thread rather than a logistical complication. Ashley's face model cried, seeing the trailer. When Capcom announced the Resident Evil 4 remake in June 2022 and released its first trailer, the Dutch model Ella Freya, who provided the face model and motion capture performance for the remake's version of Ashley Graham, posted publicly that she had cried upon seeing the trailer for the first time. She described the experience of seeing her own likeness rendered in the game's visual style as genuinely emotional, and the response from the community to her performance was largely positive. The voice actress for Ashley in the remake, Genevieve Buchner, provided a distinct vocal performance from Carolyn Lawrence's original, emphasizing a character arc that moved from frightened and overwhelmed to genuinely resourceful and determined. The creative decision to split the face model and voice actor roles, a standard practice in modern performance capture, produced a version of Ashley who reads as a distinct character from the 2005 original rather than a graphical update of the same person. The exclusion zone that still exists. The events of Resident Evil 4 did not end with Leon and Ashley escaping on Ada's jet ski. The aftermath of the Los Iluminados incident had lasting geographic consequences documented in the series' lore. According to records referenced in later Resident Evil games, the Spanish government, in coordination with the BSAA and American authorities, declared a full exclusion zone across the Valdelobos mountain range in the immediate aftermath of the island's destruction. Any surviving Ganados in the region were systematically hunted down and eliminated. By 2012, the former village, Castle Ruins, and surrounding territory were still within an active exclusion zone, a quarantine boundary preventing civilian access to an area now officially designated as a former bioterrorism site. The Plaga outbreak, despite being contained within days of Leon's mission, left an entire mountain region of Spain legally closed to habitation. The village that buzzed with chants and torchlight in the game's opening hours exists now only as a controlled ruin, surrounded by warning signs in a language its former inhabitants no longer read. The Las Plagas made it to Africa. Anyway, for all that Leon's mission technically succeeded, Sadler was killed, Ashley was extracted, the island was destroyed. The Las Plagas did not stay contained in rural Spain. Capcom confirmed through the events of Resident Evil 5 that samples of the organism found their way to the black market in the years following the Los Iluminados incident and were acquired by Tricell Incorporated's African division. Tricell's researchers conducted extensive genetic modification on what they obtained, producing Type 2 and Type 3 Plaga variants engineered for specific purposes. These were the organisms Chris Redfield and Sheva Alomar encountered in Kijuju in 2009, in one of the franchise's most ironic loops. The parasite that may have originated in Western Africa millennia ago traveled to Spain, was weaponized by Los Iluminados, was sealed, excavated, weaponized again, and then destroyed in an island explosion. Returned to the African continent as a bioweapon developed by a pharmaceutical corporation. Leon's mission in 2004 ended one chapter of the Plaga story. It did not end the story. Wesker's body after Krauser. One of the stranger post-credits footnotes in Resident Evil 4's lore involves what happened to Jack Krauser's body after his death on the island. In the original game's continuity, Albert Wesker arranged for Krauser's remains to be recovered following the mission. His interest was practical. Krauser had been implanted with a dominant strain Plaga and carried its biological material within him at the time of death. The remnants of that organism, still viable in Krauser's corpse, were extracted by Wesker and used in his subsequent bioweapons research. The dominant Plaga's genetic material, combined with the recessive sample Ada delivered, formed part of the biological toolkit Wesker assembled during the years between Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5. The man who died believing he had found genuine power and served a cause worth dying for ended up as a specimen container for the man who had sent him there in the first place. Sadler's final mutation and what it reveals. The creature that Osmond Sadler becomes in his final confrontation with Leon is one of the more biologically revealing moments in the game's creature design. The transformation does not simply enlarge Sadler or make him more aggressive. It restructures his body around the dominant Plaga he carries, with the organism manifesting physically in ways that expose the parasite's true size and operational architecture when given full expression in a suitable host. His weak points, the eyes that open on his mutated limbs, are the exposed sensory organs of the parasite itself, not Sadler's own anatomy. The human body he once inhabited has become secondary to the organism's needs, wrapped around the Plaga like scaffolding around a structure that has outgrown its original form. What the fight reveals, in its horrific visual language, is that Sadler the man stopped being the primary resident of Sadler the body some time before the final battle began. The Plaga had been winning that negotiation for years. The rocket launcher Ada throws. In both the original and the remake, the final battle with Sadler concludes with Ada Wong appearing above the arena and throwing Leon a rocket launcher, the tool he needs to finish the fight. It is one of the most theatrically satisfying moments in the game and functions perfectly as action spectacle. What the Separate Ways DLC reveals is the context for how Ada came to be in that position at that precise moment. She had been fighting her way through Sadler independently, was captured, and was being held as bait when Leon arrived. The throw of the rocket launcher is not a coincidence or a convenient dramatic gesture. It is the conclusion of a parallel mission that ran alongside Leon's through the entire game. And the rocket launcher itself was something Ada had acquired and held specifically for the purpose of eliminating Sadler. The gesture that looks, from Leon's perspective, like Ada rescuing him from above, is actually the conclusion of her own survival operation, finally merging with his at the moment it matters most. The exclusion of movement. While aiming, one mechanical decision in Resident Evil 4 that generated significant debate both at launch and in the years since is the inability to move while aiming a weapon. Players must plant their feet, take aim, and then move. They cannot do both simultaneously. This was a deliberate design choice made to preserve a specific feeling of vulnerability. In the original game's development, Mikami's team determined that allowing movement while aiming would reduce the tension of enemy encounters to a degree that undermined the game's identity. If Leon could always back away from a threat while shooting it, the player would never be forced to make the harder decision. Commit to the shot and accept the risk of being surrounded, or retreat and lose firing position. The constraint forces a kind of combat calculus that more freely mobile shooters do not require. The remake of Resident Evil 4 quietly removed this restriction, allowing Leon to move while aiming. A concession to modern player expectations that the community received as an improvement, though the original's case for the design choice remains compelling. The dog from the trap returns. In the opening section of Resident Evil 4, before the village siege begins, Leon discovers a dog caught in a steel trap along a forest path. He can choose to free the animal or walk past it. If he frees the dog, the animal disappears, and then reappears during the El Gigante boss fight in the village square, running alongside Leon and attacking the giant creature. It is one of the game's most quietly rewarding moments, a small act of mercy that pays back in an unexpected practical way. The community has spent years speculating about the dog's nature and origin. One persistent theory draws a connection between this animal and Huey, the dog companion in Capcom's horror game Haunting Ground, a game whose script, as mentioned earlier, was derived directly from one of the cancelled Resident Evil 4 prototype builds. Whether Capcom intended the visual similarity as deliberate is unconfirmed, but the connection was noticed immediately and has never been officially addressed. The shooting gallery tracks everything. The shooting gallery sequences offered by the merchant throughout the game function as more than skill challenges or idle distractions. They are calibrated specifically to the weapons and enemy types Leon encounters at each stage of the game, providing a low-stakes environment to develop precision and timing that carries directly into the subsequent chapters. The bottle cap rewards available from high scores are collectible figurines of characters from the game's cast, and the collection mechanic was one of the earliest examples of what modern games call cosmetic collectibles. Optional objects with no mechanical impact, but significant appeal to completionists. What makes the shooting galleries noteworthy from a design perspective is their implicit acknowledgement that the game knew not every player would absorb precision shooting intuitively. By building dedicated practice sequences into the world's fiction, run by the same mysterious merchant, using the same economy, Capcom created skill development that felt organic rather than instructional. The church puzzle and what it means. The stained glass puzzle that unlocks the village church, where Ashley is being held, is one of the more quietly beautiful design elements in Resident Evil 4's first act. 3 colored medallions, hidden across the village and its immediate surroundings, must be inserted into their correct positions to reveal the arrangement of light that opens the door. The puzzle requires Leon to move through the most dangerous areas of the early game, completing tasks in a region where every structure potentially holds an enemy and the geography offers constant tactical challenge. What the puzzle does narratively is established that Ashley's captors did not simply lock her in a room and post guards. They integrated her captivity into the cult's symbolic architecture. The church itself is the cult's spiritual center for the village, and unlocking it requires demonstrating familiarity with the symbols of Los Iluminados. Even rescuing her requires learning something about the thing that took her. U3 and the island's deepest experiments. Among the more unsettling creature designs in Resident Evil 4's island section is the being known as U3, a creature of ambiguous origin that functions as one of the game's most atmospheric boss encounters. Pursuing Leon through a container maze in a sequence that emphasizes the enemy's patience and adaptability over raw aggression. Luis's research notes describe U3 as one of the furthest developed products of the island's hybrid organism program, a human-animal fusion at a more advanced stage of integration than the Novistadors, representing what the Plaga could theoretically produce when the human component of the host was given additional biomass to work with. The creature retains traces of human morphology, visible particularly in its limb structure, while having developed an entirely new form of locomotion and sensory awareness. It is a thing the island's researchers created from human raw material to test what the organism was capable of producing. It answers that question, and the answer is disturbing enough that Luis stopped documenting it further. The island was always Sadler's home. While the castle represents the Salazar family's ancestral territory and the cult's historical connection to the region, the island facility offshore is more specifically Sadler's personal domain. Records from the game's in-world documents suggest the island was developed under Sadler's direct supervision as a research and production hub. The location where the Plaga's genetic modification program was housed, where the most dangerous experimental subjects were maintained, and where Krauser's paramilitary force was based. It operated at a remove from both the village and the castle precisely because the work conducted there was not something Sadler wanted visible to his general population of Ganados. Even within Los Iluminados' hierarchy, not every member of the cult had access to the island's work. The Ganados in the village were tools. The zealots in the castle were soldiers. The island was the laboratory, and what it produced was not for public consumption, even within the cult's own ranks. Mike the helicopter pilot. One of Resident Evil 4's most unexpectedly affecting moments involves a character who appears only briefly and receives no backstory whatsoever. Leon, having transmitted a distress signal from the island's radio tower, is eventually aided by a SOCOM helicopter and its pilot, referred to only as Mike, who provides devastating air support during Leon's push through the island's military compound. For approximately one chapter of gameplay, Mike's voice crackles over the radio with the easy, competent warmth of someone who clearly finds Leon's situation amusing and is nonetheless entirely committed to getting him out of it. He destroys barriers, clears enemy positions, and talks Leon through the compound with the casual professionalism of someone who has done worse things in worse places. Sadler kills him with a rocket launcher shortly after. Leon's grief is immediate and visible. It is one of the moments where the game's tonal range, usually pitched between action thriller and dark comedy, drops briefly into something quieter, and the loss of someone we barely knew registers more sharply for having arrived so suddenly. Ashley's actions. During the final boss. Ashley Graham's presence during the final confrontation with Sadler is worth noting as a detail about how the remake handled her character development. Where the original game largely had Ashley waiting at a safe distance during the boss fight, the remake puts her in active proximity to the encounter and allows her to take initiative in specific moments, including during a section where Sadler attempts to force her under his Plaga's control, and she actively resists. The scene where Sadler tries to make Ashley shoot Leon, and she fights the compulsion until the gun jams, reads in the remake as a moment of genuine will, rather than simply a failed mechanical override. She is not simply saved. She participates with everything she has in the act of saving herself. The detail matters because it recontextualizes her entire journey through the game. From the girl who had to be extracted from a church cage to someone who, at the final moment, holds the parasite's command long enough for Leon to act. The exclusivity deal that nearly ended the franchise before Resident Evil 4 existed, the franchise was in genuine commercial trouble. Following a deal Capcom struck with Nintendo to release several mainline Resident Evil titles exclusively on the GameCube, a console that had sold fewer units than even the previous generation's Nintendo 64. The series' financial performance deteriorated significantly. The Resident Evil 1 remake, widely praised as a masterpiece of the genre, managed only approximately 1.35 million copies on its GameCube exclusive release. Resident Evil 0 sold worse. The franchise that had defined survival horror in the late 1990s was moving toward irrelevance through a combination of hardware market realities and a development history too troubled to produce consistent output. Resident Evil 4's eventual success on GameCube, followed by its PlayStation 2 port, then Wii, then HD remaster, and eventually remake, is partially the story of a franchise rescuing itself from the consequences of a distribution agreement that nearly made it a footnote. Separate Ways was hidden for years. The Separate Ways scenario, which tells the events of Resident Evil 4 from Ada Wong's perspective and fills in significant gaps in the main game's narrative, was not included in the original GameCube release. It was added in the PlayStation 2 port in 2005, and most players who experienced the game in its original form never knew it existed until the port arrived. Separate Ways revealed that Ada rang the bell that saved Leon in the village that she had been working against Wesker's interest throughout, and that the sample she delivered at the mission's end was not what Wesker expected. For many players who had completed the main game multiple times, these revelations reframed scenes they had already processed. The mysterious woman appearing at critical moments, the jet ski key thrown from the helicopter, all of it gaining additional texture from the parallel story running alongside Leon's. The remake expanded Separate Ways into a substantial DLC release in September 2023, adding new content, new mechanics, and the full-scale treatment the scenario had always deserved. The Wii version changed everything about aiming. When Resident Evil 4 was ported to the Nintendo Wii in 2007, Capcom adapted the aiming system to take advantage of the Wii Remote's motion sensing capabilities, allowing players to physically point the controller at the screen to direct Leon's laser sight. The result was widely considered to be the most intuitive aiming system in any version of the game. The direct physical relationship between controller movement and on-screen cursor produced a precision and immediacy that the standard analog stick control scheme could not replicate. Multiple reviewers at the time, and community members in retrospect, have described the Wii version as the definitive way to experience the original game. Japanese game magazine Famitsu gave the Wii version 38 out of 40, with 2 reviewers awarding perfect scores. The irony is that the version of Resident Evil 4 running on Nintendo's lowest powered contemporary console, on hardware that initially drew skepticism from the hardcore gaming audience, produced the most physically engaging version of the game's most important mechanical system, the VR version and what it removed. Resident Evil 4 received a virtual reality adaptation for the Oculus Quest 2 in 2021, becoming the fastest-selling game on that platform at the time of release. The VR version placed players directly behind Leon's eyes for the first time, converting the over-the-shoulder perspective into a first-person experience and requiring the team to rebuild the game's combat and navigation systems around the physical actions of a person wearing a headset and holding motion controllers. One notable change in the VR adaptation involved specific dialogue. Luis Serra's original sexualized comment about Ashley, which had drawn criticism since the game's initial release, was removed from the VR version before it arrived in the main port as well. The change preceded the remake's handling of the same dialogue, which restructured that first encounter between Luis and Ashley to remove the offending line entirely. The VR release was, among other things, a testing ground for which elements of the original game's tone had aged less gracefully. The plaga removal machine was Luis's, the radiotherapeutic device on the island, the machine through which Leon and Ashley extract their plaga infections in the game's final act, is not a piece of Los Illuminados equipment. It is Luis Serra's. He designed and built it as part of his research into the parasite's weaknesses, constructing a device capable of delivering the high-intensity UV radiation necessary to destroy plaga tissue in a living host without killing the host in the process. The machine represents one of the practical conclusions of the same research that produced the suppressor pills. Luis working backward from the parasite's known vulnerabilities to develop a clinical solution to infection. He never got to use it on himself. He was killed before reaching the island's research facility. Leon and Ashley survived the plaga in part because Luis built them the means to do so, even though he died without knowing they found it. The machine on the island is his last gift to the mission, outlasting the man who built it. Leon declined Ashley's invitation. The game's ending, following the island's destruction and the jet ski escape, includes a brief exchange where Ashley invites Leon back to her home. Leon declines. In both the original game and the remake, he turns down the invitation with a light touch, neither cruel nor dismissive, just unavailable. The refusal is consistent with everything the game has established about Leon by this point, a man who protects people and moves on, whose relationships exist at a specific professional remove that he maintains even when he does not particularly want to. The invitation itself is part of Ashley's arc. She has spent the entire game as someone being transported from one protected location to another. And this is the first moment where she extends an invitation rather than receiving one. Leon's response is not a rejection of her. It is a recognition that the dynamic between them cannot continue beyond the mission without changing into something that would compromise what it was. He says no because saying yes would require him to become someone different, and he is not ready for that. He may never be. The Raccoon City shadow over everything. Resident Evil 4 takes place 6 years after Raccoon City, and Leon's opening monologue in both versions of the game establishes that experience as a defining wound. He describes the city's destruction, over 100,000 civilians killed in the government's sterilization operation, not as something he has processed and filed away, but as something that reorganized him. He calls it the death of his inner cop, the moment when the version of himself who believed in institutions was replaced by someone who understands those institutions are capable of treating entire cities as acceptable losses. His work as a government agent since then is complicated by that knowledge. He serves a government that he has watched decide a city full of people was expendable. When that same government sends him to Spain with a handgun and almost no intelligence, it is asking him to trust the kind of authority he watched incinerate Raccoon City. The fact that he goes anyway, that he functions, performs, and saves Ashley, is not the absence of that wound. It is what a person looks like carrying it. The GameCube version had decapitations removed in Japan. When Resident Evil 4 launched in Japan as Biohazard 4 following its initial North American release, the Japanese version included censorship that the Western release did not. Animations depicting decapitations were removed. This was a consequence of the game being the first numbered Resident Evil title, rated by the Computer Entertainment Rating Organization in Japan, which objected to the explicit nature of chainsaw and other weapon beheadings. The irony is significant given that survival horror as a genre had emerged largely from Japanese creative traditions, and Capcom itself was a Japanese company making a Japanese game. The overseas market received a more graphically complete version of a Japanese studio's work than the domestic audience did. The North American version, where a chainsaw-wielding Ganado's kill animation showed a famously visceral decapitation, was the standard against which the Japanese censored edition was measured. Dead Space drew directly from RE4. The influence of Resident Evil 4 on subsequent horror game design was not subtle or incremental. It was direct, acknowledged, and in some cases foundational. Dead Space, released by EA and Visceral Games in 2008, was originally in development as System Shock 3, before the creative team pivoted toward a new IP. The game's over-the-shoulder perspective, its emphasis on strategic dismemberment over headshots, its isolated setting, its merchant character, its weapon upgrade system, its mix of survival tension and intense action combat. All of these owe explicit debts to Resident Evil 4. The necromorphs, like the Ganados before them, are enemies that require specific tactical responses rather than simple suppression. Isaac Clarke, like Leon Kennedy, is a competent professional navigating an environment that wants to kill him with an arsenal that must be carefully managed. Dead Space was, commercially and critically, one of the most successful horror games of its decade. Its relationship to Resident Evil 4 is not imitation. It is continuation, taken somewhere new by people who understood what they were working from. Gears of War and the third-person template. The Gears of War franchise, which debuted in 2006 and became one of the defining shooter series of the 7th console generation, drew its foundational third-person combat template directly from Resident Evil 4. Designer Cliff Bleszinski and the team at Epic Games have acknowledged the influence publicly. The cover system, the over-the-shoulder perspective, the tactical body part targeting, the sense of the camera as a character sharing space with the player, rather than observing from outside. Gears took these elements into a military science fiction context, amplified the action to a far more bombastic register, and added the cover mechanics that Resident Evil 4 itself did not feature. The result was a franchise that demonstrated to the entire industry how far the template Capcom had established could travel when adapted to different tonal and mechanical priorities. Leon Kennedy fighting cultists in rural Spain, and Marcus Phoenix fighting the Locust in a devastated future city are not the same game. But Marcus could not exist without Leon. The Last of Us and The Quiet Inheritance. While Gears of War represents Resident Evil 4's influence at its most bombastic, the franchise that most effectively absorbed and transformed the original game's emotional architecture is arguably Naughty Dog's The Last of Us, released in 2013. the over-the-shoulder perspective, the escort mechanic with a companion the player must keep alive, the resource scarcity, the tonal balance between moments of desperate violence and moments of quiet, the gradual development of the relationship between the protagonist and their charge. All of this exists in Resident Evil 4 before it exists in The Last of Us. What Naughty Dog's game added was a commitment to naturalism, psychological depth, and emotional consequence that Resident Evil 4 deliberately did not pursue. The Last of Us is a slower, sadder, more serious work, but the structural DNA it inherited from Capcom's 2005 action horror game is visible in every chapter, and the escort relationship at the heart of both games is built on the same foundational design question. What does it mean to be responsible for someone you cannot fully protect? The original sold over 10 million copies. Resident Evil 4's commercial performance across its numerous platform releases over the 2 decades following its 2005 launch is among the more remarkable sustained sales curves in gaming history. The original game has sold over 10 million copies cumulatively across GameCube, PlayStation 2, Wii, PC, mobile, and HD remaster releases, a figure that represents not simply the strength of a single release, but the continued appetite for the game specifically across an unusually long commercial lifespan. This was not a game that sold well at launch and faded. It sold well at launch, continued selling across multiple platform ports, received a remaster that sold further copies, and then had its remake become the fastest-selling entry in the entire franchise's history. The 2023 remake sold approximately 4 million copies within its first 2 weeks of release, passed 6 million in its first year, and had crossed 10 million by early 2025. 2 different versions of the same story have each sold over 10 million copies. Very few games in any genre can claim that symmetry. The remake's Metacritic score, when the Resident Evil 4 remake launched in March 2023, it arrived carrying the weight of perhaps the most beloved game in its franchise and the expectations of both longtime players and a new generation encountering the story for the first time. The critical response was immediate and largely decisive. The PlayStation 5 version received a Metacritic score of 93 out of 100 at launch, placing it among the most acclaimed releases of that year and as one of the highest-rated entries in the franchise's history. Reviewers praised the expanded characterization of Ashley and Luis, the redesigned knife combat system and its durability mechanic, the deepened horror atmosphere, and the way the remake treated the original as a foundation to build from, rather than a template to replicate exactly. The original 2005 GameCube version had received a Metacritic score of 96. The remake's 93 represented not a diminishment, but an acknowledgement that remaking a near-perfect game is a different challenge than making one, and that Capcom's team had met it with exceptional craft. The knife has a lifespan in the remake. One of the remake's most discussed mechanical changes from the original is the introduction of durability for Leon's knife. Where the original game allowed Leon to use his knife indefinitely, it was an endlessly available resource for finishing off downed enemies, for parrying certain attacks, and for boss encounters where it was particularly effective. The remake gave the knife a condition meter that degrades with use and requires either Leon to spend time repairing it with resources or the merchant to restore it for a fee. The change was controversial in some quarters of the community, but the creative intention was specific. The knife's previous invincibility had reduced the tension around using it, making it a reliable safety net that players deployed without hesitation. By giving it a breakable quality, The remake made every knife use a small decision. Is this the right moment to spend condition? And do I have enough left for what's coming? Director Kazunori Kadoi specifically oversaw this system, which became one of the remake's most discussed design choices. The Separate Ways, DLC, and Pesanta. The 2023 Separate Ways DLC for the remake introduced a new enemy that had no equivalent in the original game, a creature called Pesanta, which haunts Ada's parallel mission through the village and castle sequences. Pesanta is described in the game's documents as a being that targets those who carry a specific corruption within them. And in the DLC's context, Ada has been infected during her early encounters with the creature in a way that makes her vulnerable to its illusion-based attacks. The character draws on Spanish and Catalan folklore. A Pesanta is traditionally a spirit that enters homes at night and sits on the chests of sleepers, causing nightmares and breathing difficulties. The creature's presence in the DLC roots Ada's story in the same cultural territory as the main game's Las Plagas mythology, the region's folklore, its Catholic history, its older pagan substrate, and suggests that whatever Sadler and his cult have been doing in Valdelobos has disturbed things that predate even the Plaga outbreak. The remake's knife boss fight with Krauser. One of the remake's most celebrated changes to an existing sequence involves the encounter with Jack Krauser on the island, specifically the boss fight. In the original game, the confrontation relied heavily on quick-time events, button prompts appearing on screen that the player had to hit correctly to survive Krauser's attacks. In the remake, the entire encounter was redesigned as a fully player-controlled knife fight, Leon and Krauser engaging in hand-to-hand combat, with the knife parry system that runs throughout the game becoming the entire mechanism of survival. The change was not cosmetic. It transformed a sequence that required reaction speed into one that required tactical fluency with the game's most intimate combat tool, and it gave the encounter a dramatic weight proportional to its narrative importance. This is the man who trained Leon, fighting the student with everything his infected arm can produce, making it a knife fight. The weapon both characters have used throughout the game gives the confrontation a symbolic precision the quick-time event version never had. The Sadler fight uses the whole arena. The final boss encounter with Osmond Sadler, particularly in the remake, is designed to use the entire vertical and horizontal space of the arena in ways that force constant repositioning and spatial awareness. Sadler, in his mutated form, traverses the scaffolding and elevated platforms of the steelwork structure. And Leon must track not just where the creature is, but where it is heading. Which direction will give him firing angles on its exposed weak points, and which routes the mutation is likely to block or charge. It is a fight that demands the player apply every piece of spatial and tactical knowledge accumulated through the game's preceding chapters. The arena itself is industrial. Corrugated metal, exposed beams, hanging chains, in deliberate contrast to the opulent castle and the sinister island laboratory. The most powerful figure in the game's world ends in a scrapyard, surrounded by rust, destroyed by the very tool his cult gave the man who came to stop him. Ashley's full name and what it may suggest. Ashley Graham's surname places her in a specific American cultural register, and it's worth noting that no official Capcom documentation explains why the presidential family was named Graham specifically. So what follows is a reading rather than confirmed intent. The name Graham carries strong evangelical Protestant connotations in American culture, most prominently through the famous preacher Billy Graham, and some fans have found it quietly ironic that Capcom chose an evangelical surname for the family, whose daughter a religious cult abducts and attempts to use as a vessel for its own theology. Whether this was a deliberate choice by the writing team or simply a surname that sounded plausible for an American political family is something Capcom has never clarified. What can be said is that the president himself never appears in the game. Only his daughter carries the narrative weight of his office, and her name is the first piece of information the player receives about what is at stake. Whether or not the surname carries symbolic freight, Ashley Graham's full name does its job from the very first briefing screen. The merchant's voice changed between versions. In the original 2005 Resident Evil 4, the merchant was voiced by a performer who gave the character a distinctive, slightly exaggerated British-adjacent accent, gravelly, theatrical, immediately memorable, with line deliveries that became some of the most quoted in the game's dialogue library. The "What are you buying?" and "Stranger" became community touchstones that persisted through the original game's entire commercial lifespan. In the remake, the merchant was redesigned visually and recast vocally, given a more layered performance that preserves the character's theatricality while adding a weathered quality that suggests a longer history. The original voice has become so culturally embedded in the game's identity that the remake's decision to maintain the character's essential mystery while updating every other detail was among the more delicate choices the development team had to navigate. Both versions of the voice work within their respective tones. The community's affection for the original reading has not diminished with the passage of time or the quality of the replacement. Leon's knife can parry almost anything. The knife parry system in Resident Evil 4, introduced in the original and significantly expanded in the remake, allows Leon to deflect incoming attacks with a precisely timed knife guard. In the original game, this was most notably applicable to chainsaw attacks and certain melee strikes. The remake expanded parry eligibility to cover an extraordinary range of incoming threats, not just physical melee attacks, but thrown objects, crossbow bolts, and several special attacks from elite enemies. The parry system elevates the knife from a secondary survival tool to a primary combat resource, and the mechanical sophistication of knowing when to commit to a parry versus when to dodge or retreat gives even straightforward enemy encounters a tactical dimension that sustains attention across dozens of hours of play. The developers specifically extended the parry's range to cover range projectiles as a design statement. The knife is not just a melee backup, it is a declaration of competence. The music told you where you were. Resident Evil 4's soundtrack, composed primarily by Misao Senbongi and Shusaku Uchiyama for the original, and reimagined by a new team for the remake, functions as a tonal map of the game's geography. The village section carries music that feels folk-adjacent. Strings, minor key arrangements with an almost pastoral melancholy that makes the violence happening on screen feel particularly strange. The castle's music is grander, more operatic, occasionally bordering on the absurd in its pomp, reflecting Salazar's theatrical self-presentation. The island shifts to industrial percussion and electronic textures, signaling that this section exists in a different register of threat, less cultish, more military, more clinical. The transitions between these musical identities happen without sharp breaks, bleeding into each other in ways that mirror how the environments shift. By the time Leon is on the island, the warmth that colored even the village's horror has been fully replaced by something colder and more mechanical, and the music makes sure the player feels that change in the atmosphere before they consciously register it. The milk and eggs. Early in Resident Evil 4, A farm area near the village contains chickens and cows, and both animals produce items the player can collect. Eggs, gathered from chickens, restore a small amount of health and can also be thrown at enemies for minor damage or used to stagger ganados in combat. Milk, gathered from cows, produces a similar small recovery. These items are so mundane, farm products acquired by interacting with livestock in the middle of a bioterrorism crisis, that they function as a form of tonal comedy. Leon Kennedy, former government agent and survivor of Raccoon City, hunting for eggs in a chicken coop, while Ganados patrol the path 30 meters away. The game does not wink at this. It presents farm animals and survival resources as simply coexisting in the same space, leaving the absurdity to register without comment. It is one of the earliest signals that Resident Evil 4 was going to balance its horror with a specific kind of dry, deadpan humor that the series had not quite attempted before. Hunnigan was always behind the scenes. Ingrid Hunnigan, the DSO operative who serves as Leon's remote support contact throughout the mission, is present in both the original game and the remake, providing mission intelligence and acting as the voice of institutional authority on Leon's earpiece. She is taken offline partway through the game when Los Iluminados intercepts the communications frequency, leaving Leon operating without backup at precisely the moments when the mission becomes most dangerous. Her absence during the middle and later sections of the game is felt not through any dramatic scene, but through the quality of silence on the radio. The absence of the one connection Leon has to the world outside the mission. Hunnigan returns at the game's conclusion, and her relief at hearing Leon's voice is understated but audible. She is a small character in terms of screen time, but she represents the entire institutional apparatus that sent Leon into this situation. And the fact that the apparatus was knocked offline and Leon functioned anyway is its own kind of statement about what a person can do when there is genuinely no help coming. The Ganado voices were recorded in Spanish. The Ganados in Resident Evil 4 do not shout in any generic or nonsense language. Their voiced lines were recorded in actual Spanish, performed by Spanish-speaking voice actors hired specifically to give the villagers an authentic linguistic texture. Phrases like muere, die, and cógelo, get him, can be heard clearly during encounters, and players with Spanish fluency have noted that the dialogue is grammatically sound rather than phonetically approximate. The decision to use real Spanish rather than invented sounds was part of the same commitment to cultural specificity that sent the development team to photograph actual Spanish and Welsh castles for the game's environments. The Ganados' language makes them feel like people who existed before the Plaga, who had lives and words and a culture that the parasite has now repurposed for something else. Their dialogue is not just ambient noise, it is the residue of humanity speaking through mouths that no longer belong entirely to it. The Regenerador sound design. The Regenerators in Resident Evil 4 are frightening in two distinct registers. Visually, through their impossible healing and distorted proportions, and aurally, through one of the most carefully designed ambient sounds in horror game history. They breathe. The sound is wet, rhythmic, deeply wrong. A biological respiration that should not be possible from a form as corrupted as the one producing it. The breathing can be heard before the creature is visible, which means that encountering a Regenerador involves a progressive escalation of dread. First sound, then sight, then the realization that the thing you are hearing cannot simply be killed with the tools you have been using all game. The sound design was not accidental. Shinji Mikami described the Regeneradors as a deliberate survival horror anchor in a game that had moved significantly toward action, and their audio profile is a large part of why they succeed. The sound they make does not let the player settle. It is the sound of something still alive when it should not be, still coming when it should have stopped. The remake's Blue Medallion requests. One design element that the remake significantly expanded from the original was the side mission system built around the merchant's blue request notes. Small handwritten slips posted in various locations throughout the village, castle and island, each offering Leon an optional objective in exchange for a reward of spinels, the game's secondary currency used to purchase special items. The original Resident Evil 4 had a version of this in the village's Blue Medallion Challenge, but the remake extended it into a sustained side quest framework that runs the entire length of the game. These requests include destroying symbols, hunting specific enemy types, and obtaining particular materials, and they are structured so that completing them advances Leon's relationship with the merchant's economy in ways that reward thorough exploration. The development team specifically noted that they had observed how isolated the original Blue Medallion mini-quest felt in the village section, and decided to build that impulse into every chapter of the remake. The Separate Ways title has two meanings. The name of Ada Wong's parallel scenario, Separate Ways, operates on two levels simultaneously. It describes the physical structure of the narrative. Ada and Leon pursue different paths through the same geography, their stories running parallel but rarely converging. It also describes the emotional architecture of their relationship. Throughout both the main game and the Separate Ways DLC, Ada and Leon operate in proximity, save each other, share moments of something that resembles genuine feeling, and then consistently and deliberately choose not to act on it. By the time she pilots the helicopter away from the island, the title has accumulated all of that weight. They have been in the same world, facing the same threat, making decisions that repeatedly intersected, and they will not go forward together. Separate Ways is not just an action. It is a description of how they have always operated, and perhaps always will. What happened to the village? After Leon and Ashley escaped, the island exploded. Sadler and his lieutenants were dead, but the village of Valdelobos, the stone houses, the mill, the lake, the church where Ashley was held, did not disappear. Government and BSAA teams moved into the region after the mission was reported, and systematic elimination of surviving ganados was carried out. The scale of the infection across the population meant that virtually no one in Valdelobos had been left uninfected. The people who had lived there before Sadler's excavation crew inhaled the dormant plaga spores. The farmers and craftspeople and children who had shunned modern technology and lived by rhythms that predated the industrial era were gone before Leon ever arrived. What he found in that village was already a community turned fully into something else. The buildings would have remained after the cleanup. The people they had housed would not come back. The exclusion zone surrounding Valdelobos is not simply a quarantine against biological contamination. It is a perimeter around a village that no longer exists in any meaningful sense. Leon's age and physical design in the remake. The version of Leon Kennedy that appears in the 2023 remake is noticeably more physically substantial than his 2005 counterpart. Broader shouldered, more muscular, a frame that reflects additional years of operational training beyond what the original game's somewhat slender protagonist suggested. Director Kazunori Kadoi noted in interviews that the redesign was intended to reflect both the physical reality of someone who has spent years in demanding government service and the visual expectations of a modern audience accustomed to higher fidelity character models. One detail that was specifically retained from the original game was Leon's hair, the particular styling that falls across part of his face, which had become as recognizable as any other element of his design. In the remake's continuity, Leon is 26 years old at the time of the mission. The body the remake presents is what 6 years of government training and classified operations does to a person who was already athletic when he walked into Raccoon City. The Regenerador's weakness required a tool to see. One of Resident Evil 4's most memorable examples of environmental storytelling as mechanical instruction involves the thermal scope, a weapon attachment available in the castle's later sections that reveals heat signatures through objects and walls. The game places a note near the scope explaining that the Plaga organisms inside a Regenerador can be destroyed individually to stop its healing, but that locating them requires a device capable of seeing through the creature's host tissue. The scope reveals glowing Plaga positions through the Regenerador's body, turning the creature from an effectively immortal obstacle into a solvable problem, one that still requires significant skill and composure to address, but a problem with a visible solution. The mechanic is an elegant example of how Resident Evil 4 handled information as a resource. The Regenerador is not meant to be impossible. It is meant to be impossible until you understand it, at which point it becomes terrifying for different reasons. The ending and what Leon reports. After the events of Resident Evil 4, Leon submitted an official report to the DSO and USST RATCOM detailing what he had encountered in Valdalobos. That report, referenced briefly in Resident Evil 5 when Chris Redfield notes having reviewed Leon's documentation, described Las Plagas in enough detail that the subsequent BSAA investigation into bioweapons market activity in Africa used it as a baseline for identifying similar organisms. The report was one of the first formal government documents acknowledging Las Plagas as a weaponizable biological agent outside of Los Iluminados' internal research. Its existence helped shape the international bioterrorism response infrastructure that Resident Evil 5 depicts, a world now actively tracking Plaga distribution through black market channels. What Leon wrote in that report, the clinical translation of everything he experienced in that village and castle and on that island, became foundational intelligence for the next phase of the franchise's history. The Hookman's legacy in the remake. Fans of the cancelled Hookman version of Resident Evil 4. The 2003 prototype featuring the ghostly adversary and Leon's hallucinatory enemies got a small, quiet acknowledgement in the 2023 remake. At a specific point during Ashley's solo section in the castle, she passes through a hallway where a painting depicting a hook-handed figure hangs on the wall. It is visible for only a moment, easy to miss, and carries no explanation. It is purely for the players who know what it is, a nod to the version of the game that existed on a demo disc at E3 2003 that generated enormous excitement and then quietly disappeared, that became one of gaming's most discussed cancelled prototypes. The hook still hangs in the castle 20 years later, finally given a home in the only version of Resident Evil 4 that actually exists. The story does not end with the rescue. Leon and Ashley's story does not conclude with the jet ski. Following their escape from the island, both were apprehended by US government agents and placed in detention for debriefing. A procedurally correct response to a classified agent returning from AUA's mission involving bioweapons exposure and an unconfirmed chain of events. The debriefing process, while not dramatized in the game, is referenced in materials surrounding the game's ending, and is consistent with how intelligence operations of that classification handle returns. Leon was cleared, continued his career, and would go on to further classified missions depicted in Resident Evil, Infinite Darkness, Resident Evil, Damnation, and Resident Evil 6. Ashley returned to her life, though what exactly that life looked like. The daughter of a US president who was kidnapped by a Spanish parasite cult and nearly used to spread a mind-controlling organism through the American government. The series does not fully address. She survived. She went back. What came after is a question the franchise has left open, suspended in the quiet that follows the extraordinary. The sequel that changed everything this changed, Resident Evil 5, released in 2009, is the most direct and complicated inheritor of Resident Evil 4's legacy. It retained the over-the-shoulder camera, the Las Plagas organism as its central biological threat, and the resource management and combat systems that Resident Evil 4 had established, but added online co-op, moved to an African setting, and pushed even further into action-oriented gameplay while reducing the survival horror atmosphere to near zero. The result was a game that sold exceptionally well, better at initial release than Resident Evil 4, but that many consider a wrong turn. A game that took the previous entry's lessons about action horror and discarded the horror in favor of pure action. The debate about Resident Evil 5's relationship to its predecessor is one the community has never fully resolved. What both games agree on, whatever their differences, is that Las Plagas is interesting enough to sustain a second major story, and that the world Resident Evil 4 built was large enough to hold another chapter without shrinking. The knife fight that defines a generation. There is a moment in the Resident Evil 4 remake, in the Krauser boss fight, in the ruins of the island, where the two men are not separated by gunfire or the noise of explosions, but by 6 inches of distance and the length of a blade. Krauser's infected arm produces something that should not be fair. Leon's knife is a piece of steel that has spent the entire game being used to open crates and dispatch downed enemies. And yet, the fight works because everything in the game has been building toward the capacity for this moment. Every knife parry learned in the village, every close-range confrontation calibrated in the castle, every decision to use the blade when other weapons were available. The remake earns this encounter by treating the knife not as a backup, but as a statement about how well Leon was trained, about how seriously he has taken the tool his mentor gave him, about what it means to fight the person who taught you using the most intimate weapon you have. Whatever Krauser became, he made Leon who he is. The knife remembers. The attaché case was designed around decision-making. Leon's rectangular attaché case, the inventory management system at the heart of Resident Evil 4's resource economy, was not designed simply as a container for ammunition and healing items. It was designed as a space where decisions are made. Every item in the game has physical dimensions within the grid, and placing them efficiently requires the player to think spatially, to rotate items, to decide which weapons earn the space they occupy and which should be sold or left behind. The attaché case is one of the first times a video game treated inventory management not as a menu to navigate, but as a puzzle to solve. Each upgrade increases its size, expanding the available grid and opening new strategic possibilities. And the decision of which upgrades to pursue is itself a form of strategic planning about how the next section of the game will be approached. The case is a remarkably quiet piece of design that sits at the center of the game's entire economic logic, and players who have returned to Resident Evil 4 across multiple playthroughs often cite mastering the case as one of the activities that keeps the game fresh. The merchant's prices are calibrated to pressure. The merchant's economy in Resident Evil 4 is not simply a shop, it is a pressure system. Weapons are priced such that a player conserving resources carefully can afford meaningful upgrades, but cannot afford everything, which forces continuous evaluation of which capabilities matter most for the playstyle being developed. Ammunition is available for purchase, but buying it means spending currency that could go toward weapon tuning. Weapon tuning multiplies long-term efficiency, but requires upfront investment at moments when the player may feel immediately underprepared. The merchant knows, or rather, the design knows, that the most stressful moment in any playthrough is the moment before a new chapter, when the player surveys their resources, surveys the price list, and tries to predict what the game is about to ask of them. The tension between preparation and acquisition is one of the game's most consistently engaging mechanics, and it is entirely invisible unless you are the one managing it. The chainsaw enemies and what they communicate. Among the most memorable enemy designs in Resident Evil 4's village section are the chainsaw-wielding Ganados, Dr. Salvador in the original, joined by the Chainsaw Sisters in later encounters, whose presence instantly communicates something the standard pitchfork-wielding villagers cannot: the cost of standing still. The chainsaw enemies function as a form of environmental pressure more than a straight combat challenge, since their lethality at close range forces constant movement and space management in ways that teach the player the game's fundamental mobility lesson. The sound of a chainsaw engine revving, that distinctive mechanical growl cutting through the ambient fog, became one of the most recognizable audio cues in horror game history, and was specifically preserved and enhanced in the remake's sound design. Shinji Mikami has described enemy design in RE4 as being built around teaching the player through fear. You learn what not to do, because the thing with the chainsaw will show you very quickly what happens when you do it. The lake monster's sacrifice, Del Lago, the enormous aquatic creature that Leon pursues across the village lake in a motorboat, is one of Resident Evil 4's most tonally distinctive encounters. A previously ordinary salamander, massively enlarged through Plaga integration, it had been placed in the lake by Los Iluminados as a guardian of the waterway between the village and the castle. The cult found, to their frustration, that it could not be controlled through a dominant Plaga the way human hosts could. Based on what the in-game documents suggest, the organism's physiology simply did not respond to the command hierarchy the way human nervous systems did. Rather than destroy an asset this size, they isolated it in the lake, fed it the bodies of outsiders and interlopers, and called it sacred. The notes left by cult members around the lake's perimeter describe Del Lago with a reverence consistent with Los Iluminados' practice of treating their most extreme bioweapons as divine instruments, creatures made holy by the Plaga's influence rather than corrupted by it. Leon kills Del Lago with a harpoon from a boat on that fog-shrouded water, and the creature's death is accompanied by a gravity that the game does not usually extend to its more monstrous enemies. It was an animal before. The cult made it into something else, chained it to a body of water, and called it sacred. It was not sacred. It was simply large and afraid, and unable to leave. Mendez's eye and what it means. In both the original game and the remake, Leon's first encounter with the village chief, Vitores Mendez, ends with Mendez looking into Leon's face and recognizing something. The early stage yellowing of eyes that indicates recent Plaga implantation. He stops his assault and releases Leon, telling him that they now share the same blood. This moment is one of the game's most quietly disturbing biological details. The plaga in Mendez's body recognized the newly implanted plaga in Leon's body through whatever chemical or frequency channel the organisms use to communicate. Two separate hosts, two separate infections at completely different stages. And the older, more integrated organism was able to sense the younger one through the barriers of two human bodies standing in the same room. The hive mind extended recognition to Leon, not because Leon deserved it, but because the thing inside him transmitted its presence to the thing inside Mendez, and parasites do not kill their own. The village bell tower's hidden function, the church bell that rings during the opening village siege, the one Ada rings to save Leon, though he does not know this, is not simply a plot convenience. It plays into the game's established lore about how Ganados respond to Los Iluminados' command signals. The bell, in the context of the cult's practices, functions as a recall signal, a command frequency delivered through physical sound rather than the plaga's internal channels, used specifically to summon infected followers to the church for cult gatherings. It overrides their attack impulse not because of Ada's specific intervention, but because the sound triggers a deep behavioral conditioning installed through months of cult practice and plaga reinforcement. The Ganados do not stop attacking Leon because someone rang a bell. They stop because every time that bell has rung, for as long as they have been infected, it has meant go to the church. The instinct is stronger than the aggression. Ada did not save Leon with a clever plan. She saved him by knowing how the cult had already programmed its followers to behave. The PS2 port changed the franchise's trajectory. When Capcom announced in October 2004 that Resident Evil 4 would receive a PlayStation 2 port following its GameCube launch, it was not simply a business decision. It was an acknowledgement that the GameCube exclusivity strategy had been commercially damaging, and that the franchise needed the larger install base of Sony's console to reach the audience it deserved. The PlayStation 2 version, released later in 2005, included separate ways, new costumes, and additional weapons, and by January 2007, it had exceeded 2 million copies sold, outselling even the GameCube original's 1.6 million on that single platform. Given the PlayStation 2's enormous global install base relative to the GameCube's, it stands to reason that for a large portion of the worldwide audience, the PS2 version was their first encounter with Resident Evil 4. The port made the game's future decisions possible. It meant Resident Evil 5 would not be a GameCube sequel to a GameCube game. It meant the franchise could chase the next console generation without the constraint of a distribution agreement that had been actively limiting its audience. Luis and the night he kept returning to. What the remake's characterization of Luis Serra makes clear, through his repeated Don Quixote references, the way he frames his own mission in the language of errant knighthood, and his final self-aware sacrifice, is that this was a book he had read more than once and continued to find meaningful. The parallel he draws between himself and Cervantes' delusional hero is not simply a joke. Don Quixote is a story about a man who convinces himself he is living inside a noble adventure, and who through that delusion performs acts of genuine courage even as the world tells him he is simply a fool tilting at windmills. Luis knows he was on the wrong side for years. He understands that he helped build things that hurt people. The question the character poses, which the Don Quixote parallel quietly frames, is whether a man who arrives too late to prevent the damage he helped cause can still be the hero of the final chapter. Based on how the remake resolves his arc, the answer the writers seem to have arrived at is yes. but the cost of that answer is everything. The Saddler tentacle foreshadows his mutation. Throughout Resident Evil 4, before Saddler's final form is revealed, his dominant Plaga manifests in small but visible ways during his interactions with other characters. The scorpion-like appendage he uses to impale Luis, extending from beneath his robes, organic and precisely controlled, is not a weapon he carries. It is part of him. The Plaga has already reconfigured portions of his body to suit its operational needs, producing biological tools that extend beyond the normal human form while leaving the host's visible presentation intact. Saddler can walk and talk and gesture with the practiced authority of a cult leader while carrying beneath his robes an organism that has partially replaced his anatomy with something else. His final mutation in the boss fight is not a transformation from human to monster. It is the last remaining pretense of human presentation being discarded. The Plaga dropping the performance entirely because it has won and no longer needs the costume. The game's title screen never shows the full picture. In the original Resident Evil 4, the title screen, a minimalist image of the game's logo against a background that shifts slightly, does not telegraph the visual spectacle or the horror that waits inside. It is still, quiet. The logo itself is the most elaborate element in the frame. This deliberate restraint is part of a specific design philosophy about entry points, the game's opening minutes, not its menu, are where the tone is established. The player arrives in a car. Two Spanish police officers who barely speak make small talk. Leon gets out and walks up a forest path toward a house. The violence, when it comes without warning, and without the flourishes of a title card that prepared the player for it. The title screen is doing the same work the forest path is doing, giving you a moment of normalcy before the normalcy ends. By the time you understand what the game is, you are already inside it. The Ganados are not all the same. One of the details that rewards careful attention in Resident Evil 4's early village section is that the Ganados do not all behave identically. Some are aggressive from the moment they detect Leon. Others, particularly those engaged in specific tasks at a distance, do not immediately attack, observing before moving. The lore provides an explanation for this. The Plaga's command hierarchy does not set every host to the same behavioral mode. Standard Ganados follow broad behavioral presets influenced by the dominant strain organisms in their vicinity, and a host absorbed in an assigned task may not register a distant stranger as an immediate threat until the host comes closer, or until other Ganados around them react. This also explains why groups of Ganados often seem to coordinate their responses. One's Plaga detects the threat, and the signal propagates through the community before the hosts themselves have visually confirmed anything. The village is not a mob of zombies stumbling toward movement. It is, from the parasite's perspective, a managed population performing assigned functions until those functions change.